First thing under the hood, I would check my wiring, metal tubing, hoses and clamps for any cracks, breaks, leaks, dry rot, bubbles, or tears, and that all items are secured in place with proper screws, nuts, or bolts. And I would check the other side of the bus the same way from the firewall throughout the engine. Next, we would check the oil dipstick. The dipstick is not cracked, broken, or leaking. The dipstick is checked with the engine off. The color of the oil is brown, and you would remove the dipstick, wipe it, reinsert it, and pull it out again. It should read between the full and the add line. Next, we'll be checking the radiator overflow container. I'd check the coolant with a sight glass if equipped. If not equipped with a sight glass, I'd remove the radiator reservoir cap when the engine is cool. The fluid will be red or green, and the level should be at least half full. I would also check that the rubber hose leading to the container is not split, cracked, or broken, or showing signs of dry rot. I would check the radiator overflow container is not cracked, broken, or leaking. All the bolts and screws appear to be present, and it is secure to the bus. Now we'll check the alternator, serpentine belt, and the water pump. We'll check that the alternator is not cracked, broken, or welded, or worn. The wires are attached and in their casing with no cuts or frays. The serpentine belt runs the alternator and the water pump, with the bus being belt driven. We'll check that the serpentine belt is not cracked, broken, dry rotted, or frayed. When pressing on the serpentine belt, there should be no more than 3/4 of an inch in play in the belt. We'll check also that the water pump is not cracked or broken or leaking. All of the bolts and screws on the alternator, serpentine belt, and water pump appear to be present, and the items are secure to the bus. Next, we'll check the washer fluid and the washer fluid container. The fluid is blue and should be at least 1/2 full. The container is not cracked, broken, or leaking. You should also check wiring and rubber hoses to make sure they are not leaking or showing signs of dry rot, bubbles, or tears. All the screws and bolts appear to be present, and the item is secure to the bus. Now we will check our frame. The frame appears to be straight. No holes other than manufacturing holes should be present. The frame doesn't have any wells, cracks, and isn't worn, and is properly secure to the bus with its bolts. I would check the frame on the other side of the engine compartment to the rear the same way. I would check my shock absorber, making sure it's not damaged or leaking, and it's securely mounted to the bus with the proper screws and bolts. I have my 2 spring mounts, and you would point them out. I would check that they have no cracks, breaks, wells, and aren't worn. The spring mounts are properly greased, and they are properly attached to the bus with the screws and bolts. I would now check my U-bolts and leaf springs. I would check to make sure my leaf springs are not missing, broken, bent, and that they are all aligned. My axle appears to be straight, not bent, cracked, or broken, or welded. Next, I would check my tie rod, making sure it's straight, not bent, cracked, or broken. Then I'd check my tie rod end, along with the bolt and cotter pins. I would check the other side of the engine compartment the same way. On checking my brake system, depending on if I had brake calipers and rotors or a brake drum, I'd check my brake area and hose for any leaks, breaks, dry rot, tears, bubbles, or leaks. To check my brakes, I'd remove the tire. The brake pads should be no less than 1/4 of an inch thick, with no oil or grease on the brake pads. I'd also make sure that all the screws and bolts are in place and it is properly secure. I'd check all the other areas on the bus the same way. In checking my front tire, it should be no less than 4/32 of an inch tread depth. It should be evenly worn. You may not have recap or retreaded tires on the front. Both tires must be matching. You would point around the side of the tire. I would check for any cracks, tears, rips, gouges, or bubbles, and that the rim is not embedded in the tire. The rim should not be bent, cracked, or broken. My tire should have 85 to 95 psi in pressure. I would check the pressure with an air pressure gauge. My valve stem appears to be straight. There should be a dust cap present and it isn't cracked, broken, or leaking. The grease seal cap should not be cracked, broken, or leaking, and the grease seal bolts and lug nuts should not have any rust trails indicating looseness. Then I would tell the examiner I would check the tire system and items I've explained here on the other side of the bus the same way as I did this side. Next, we would go over to the driver's side of the bus to check the brake fluid reservoir. We'll check that there's no cracks, breaks, or leaks, and all of the screws and bolts appear to be present and in place, securing it to the bus. Next, we'll check our power steering fluid container and hose. There should be no cracks, breaks, wells, and isn't worn and has no leaks. It should be checked with the engine off or on. To check the fluid, remove the dipstick, wipe it, reinsert it, and pull it out again. It should be reading between full and add. Check the hose and clamp for cuts, cracks, leaks, bubbles, or bumps. I check to make sure the screws and bolts were in place and the entire system is secured to the bus. Next, I would check my transmission dipstick. I'd check the oil with the engine on, warmed, and in neutral. The dipstick appears to be straight and is not cracked, broken, or leaking and is secure. To check the oil, I would remove the dipstick, wipe it, reinsert it, and pull it out again, and it should read between full and add. Next, we'll check our steering column boot, steering column with U-joints, and steering gearbox. I would check that the steering column boot is not dry rotted and doesn't have any cracks, cuts, or bubbles. The shaft should be straight, not cracked, broken, welded, or worn. The shaft should rotate but not bounce. The U-joint is well greased and the gearbox is not cracked, broken, or leaking fluid, and the hoses are not leaking fluid. I would check my pitman arm, drag link, steering knuckle, bolts, and cotter pins are not cracked, broken, welded, missing, or worn. The U-joints, gearbox, and steering knuckle should all be well greased. I would check to make sure all of these items have proper screws and bolts and that they are all secure to the bus. At this time, you would step back, look around, double check both sides for missing items. If you feel you've missed something, go ahead and repeat or say what you've missed. You would then say, "This concludes the engine inspection," and then you would close the hood. Once you close the hood, you may not reopen the hood to go back to the items. Then you would walk to the passenger side and begin your passenger pre-trip.